sometime around 1990. The exact date has never been confirmed, and perhaps that is fitting for a story built on decades of silence. A young woman knocked on a door in Los Angeles. She was in her late 20s. She had dark hair, steady hands, and a question she had carried for as long as she could remember. The door belonged to a man the world believed could not be surprised, could not be shaken, could not be caught off guard. He had won 6 consecutive world middleweight karate championships. He had killed hundreds of men on screen without flinching. He had built an empire of martial arts schools and starred in films that grossed hundreds of millions. Within 15 years, the entire internet would declare him functionally immortal. The door opened. She stood there. And she said quite simply, "Hello, I'm your daughter." Carlos Ray Norris, Chuck Norris to the world, but Carlos to his mother and to the ghost of his conscience, stood in that doorway and could not speak, not because he was confused, not because he doubted her. He could not speak because he had known about her since 1963. He had chosen silence every single day for nearly 3 decades, the way a man chooses to hold his breath underwater, deliberately, painfully, and with the full awareness that eventually something must give. This is not a story about karate. It is not a story about action films or internet memes or the mythology of American masculinity. Those things are in it, the way furniture is in a house, present, visible, occasionally useful, but they are not the load-bearing walls. This is a story about what it costs to be strong, about what hides behind the fist, about a man who spent his life hitting others because he could never hit the one person who deserved it, his own father, and who spent decades running from a truth that a young woman delivered in 5 words on a Los Angeles doorstep. To understand where that fear was born, you must travel 1,500 miles east and half a century back, to a dusty town in Oklahoma where a boy named Carlos dreamt of only one thing, that his father might come home sober. Ryan, Oklahoma, had a population of roughly 800 when Carlos Ray Norris arrived on the 10th of March, 1940. The Great Depression had ended officially, but its shadow still lay across the plains like a stain that soap could not reach. The houses were small. The roads were dirt. The wind came from the west carrying red dust and the faint smell of cattle, and it never really stopped. His father was Ray D. Norris, part Irish, part Cherokee, all trouble. A manual laborer when he was sober, which was not often enough, and a disappearing act when he was not. Ray D. drank the way some men breathe, automatically, without thought, without the ability to stop. He would vanish for days, sometimes weeks, and return smelling of whiskey and regret, his temper short, his promises empty. The boy learned early that promises from men meant nothing. His mother was Wilma Scarberry, German-Irish stock, quiet, devout, and possessed of the kind of strength that does not announce itself because it is too busy holding everything together. Wilma went to church on Sundays. She cooked meals from almost nothing. She worked jobs that paid almost less. And she raised 3 boys with a ferocity that only mothers who have been abandoned understand. After Ray D. left for the last time, when Carlos was about 16, Wilma gathered her sons and said what she always said. "We'll manage. We always have." It was not poetry. It was the plain, exhausted truth of a woman who did not have time for drama. Carlos was the eldest. This meant he became the man of the house by default, at an age when most boys are worrying about football tryouts. He had no model for what a man was supposed to be, except the inverse of his father, present instead of absent, sober instead of drunk, reliable instead of reckless. It was a definition built entirely on negation. It stopped the bleeding. It did not heal the wound. The family moved constantly, Wilma chasing work, chasing cheaper rent. Carlos attended multiple schools across Oklahoma and California, never staying long enough to make real friends. Always the new boy, always the quiet one in the back row. He was not athletic. He was not academic. He was, by every measurable standard of 1950s American boyhood, invisible. Think about that for a moment. The man who would become the most famous martial artist in American history, whose roundhouse kick would enter the lexicon of global pop culture. That man, as a teenager, could not walk up to a girl in a school corridor and introduce himself. He was paralyzed by shyness, so severe it bordered on social anxiety. He later described himself as the most unlikely tough guy in the history of tough guys, and for once the self-deprecation was simply accurate. There were 3 brothers, and each absorbed the family's damage differently. Carlos went quiet. He built walls. Wieland, born in 1943, went loud, the brave one, the reckless one, the boy who laughed at things that made his older brother flinch. Aaron, the youngest, born in 1951, watched both of them and said little. He would grow up to become a director, always behind the camera, the family pattern of silence expressed through a different medium. Ray Norris died in 1971, largely forgotten. Carlos almost never spoke of his father publicly. The silence was not dignified restraint. It was a locked door behind which something still burned. At 17, Carlos had nothing. No father, no money, no direction. What he had was a girl named Diane Holchek, who saw something in this quiet young man that no one else could see. They married in December of 1958 in Torrance, California. He was 18. The wedding was modest. Within weeks, he enlisted in the United States Air Force. The Air Force sent him to Osan Air Base in South Korea, and it was there that 2 things happened which would define the rest of his life. The first was small, a joke. A fellow serviceman on the base could not pronounce Carlos. The name stuck in his throat, came out mangled, and finally he gave up. "Look," the man said, "you look like a Chuck to me. You're Chuck now." And just like that, Carlos Ray Norris ceased to exist. In his place stood someone new, a name that sounded like a punch, a name that had nothing to do with Oklahoma or poverty or a father who smelled of whiskey. The second thing was consequential in ways that a nickname could never be. Off duty, with time to fill, the young airman wandered into a martial arts gymnasium, a dojang. The art practice there was a blend of Taekwondo and Tang Soo Do. Fast, brutal, elegant. Chuck had never thrown a punch with any technique. He had never felt the particular addictive satisfaction of executing a movement so precisely that the air itself seems to crack. He felt it now. And something dormant through all the years of hiding and enduring woke up. Martial arts gave him what his father never had, the feeling that he could defend himself, that the world no longer had the right to strike him without consequence. He trained with a devotion that startled his instructors. He trained before dawn and after dinner. He trained until his shins bled and his knuckles swelled, and then he trained some more. It was not discipline. It was desperation, the desperation of a man who has finally found the one thing that makes the noise inside his head go quiet. While Chuck was discovering his body's capacity for controlled violence in Korea, Diane was back in California, waiting. In 1962, their first son was born, Mike. The family now had a shape, but the father was overseas, and the shape was more outline than substance. Chuck returned to March Air Force Base in Riverside County. He was 22. He had a wife, an infant son, a new name, and a new obsession. He also had a secret that would take nearly 3 decades to surface. Sometime in 1962 or 63, the young airman began a brief affair with a woman named Johanna. He revealed the details himself, decades later, in his memoir Against All Odds, and even there the account is clipped, almost clinical. Johanna became pregnant. She gave birth to a daughter named Dina. In 1962, Chuck Norris was a married Baptist with an infant son. He knew what the Bible said about adultery. He knew what his mother would say. And he chose to say nothing, not to Johanna, not to Diane, not to anyone. He buried the fact of his daughter's existence the way a man buries a body, quickly, thoroughly, with the understanding that the ground might shift at any time. No other affairs have ever been substantiated by any credible source. Just Dina. Just the one lie, sustained for a lifetime. But one lie, if large enough, can do the work of 100. After his discharge, Chuck took a job at the Northrop Corporation, steady work, decent pay, precisely the kind of future boys from his background were supposed to be grateful for. He lasted long enough to realize that gratitude and fulfillment are not the same thing. He opened his first martial arts school, then a second, then a third. He entered tournaments, and a detail the mythology conveniently omits he lost. Repeatedly. He joked about it later. I lost so many fights that the judges knew me by my first name. Then I started winning, and they stopped saying hello. But he did start winning. In 1968, he claimed his first professional middleweight karate championship, and he held it for 6 consecutive years. His technique was so precise that fellow champions described fighting him as trying to solve a maths problem while someone hits you in the face. He was not the biggest or the strongest. He was simply the most relentless, and relentlessness, as any child of an alcoholic knows, is the one skill that hardship teaches for free. A second son, Eric, arrived in 1964 or 65. Diane was now mother to 2 boys, wife to a man whose fame was growing in a world she did not fully share. Beneath the foundation of their marriage, invisible and corrosive, the secret of Dina was eating through the concrete like acid through limestone. During his championship years, the school attracted students who would change his life. The most important was Steve McQueen, lean, cool, the embodiment of 60s masculinity. After a training session, McQueen told him, "You're too good for the dojang. You belong on screen." Chuck shook his head. "Steve, I can't even hold a proper conversation on the phone." McQueen grinned. "Perfect. Fewer words, more kicks. That's cinema." It was also during this period, in 1968, at a tournament in Long Beach, California, that Chuck met the man who would become his closest equal. His name was Bruce Lee. The meeting was not dramatic. 2 men, a gymnasium, the mutual recognition that sometimes passes between people who operate at the same level of physical mastery. Lee was a philosopher of combat, fast, innovative, intellectually restless. Norris was a soldier of combat, disciplined, relentless, grounded in technique. They were opposites in almost every way, and the friendship worked precisely because of those differences. They trained together throughout the late 60s. Lee learned from Norris the devastating power of high kicks. Norris later claimed he was the one who convinced Lee to incorporate high kicks into his film choreography. Lee, in return, taught Norris something far more difficult: the idea that fighting could be art, that the body in motion could express something beyond aggression. It was, by all accounts, a genuine exchange between two men who respected each other without jealousy. In 1972, Lee invited Norris to Hong Kong to appear in The Way of the Dragon, the final fight scene set in the Roman Colosseum, because Lee's imagination did not recognize restraint, remains one of the most celebrated sequences in martial arts cinema. It was not Chuck's first screen appearance. He had made a forgettable cameo in The Wrecking Crew in '69, but it was his first significant role. Lee saw something in him. McQueen had seen it. The audience saw it. The only person who did not see it was Norris himself, who walked off set convinced that acting was a hobby. Bruce Lee died on the 20th of July, 1973. He was 32. According to students who knew Norris during this period, he spoke about Lee with a weight that went beyond professional admiration. Bruce lived as though he knew time was short, he reportedly said. It turned out he was right. Another loss. Another door closed. Another person gone before the conversation could continue, but Lee's death was not the worst blow of those years. That distinction belongs to a telegram that arrived at the Dojang on a June afternoon in 1970, 2 years after the Long Beach tournament, 3 years before Lee's death. A piece of paper that carried news from the other side of the world and shattered everything it touched. Vietnam, for most Americans, was a word on a television screen. It arrived in their living rooms every evening at 6 o'clock, sandwiched between advertisements for laundry detergent and station wagons. A war served in neat, digestible portions, horrifying enough to provoke conversation at dinner, but distant enough to forget by bedtime. For the families who sent their sons, it was not a word. It was a hole in the floor of the world, and everything you loved could fall through it without warning. Wieland Clyde Norris, born 1943, was the middle brother, the loud one, the fearless one, the boy who ran towards things that made other people retreat. He had joined the United States Army and been assigned to the 101st Airborne Division, the Screaming Eagles, one of the most storied units in American military history. The Eagles did not accept cowards. Wieland was not a coward. By 1970, the war was in its most bitter phase. Nixon had promised Vietnamization, which in practice meant American soldiers were still fighting and dying, while their government publicly insisted the fighting was nearly over. In the jungle-covered mountains of Thua Thien Hu province, near the Laotian border, the 101st Airborne was conducting Operation Texas Star, one of the last major American ground offensives of the conflict, centered on a remote hilltop installation called Firebase Ripcord. It was a name that meant nothing to the public then and means almost nothing now. But for the men who fought there, Ripcord was hell with a postal code. The North Vietnamese army had surrounded the base. Artillery rained down. Supplies could not get in. Casualties could not get out. For 23 days, the garrison held on through stubbornness, courage, and the absence of any better option. Wieland was there. On the 3rd of June, 1970, during a firefight described in military records with the cold precision of bureaucratic language, hostile small arms fire, perimeter engagement, he did something that the records describe with slightly less coldness. He helped save his platoon. The details vary by account, the outcome does not. Wieland Clyde Norris was killed by enemy fire. He was 26 years old. Chuck was in his dojang when the news arrived. He was training. He was always training, because training was the one place where the noise stopped. Someone entered. Someone held out a telegram. He read it. According to students present that day, he removed his gloves slowly, walked to the center of the mat, sat down on the floor, and remained there for 2 hours. Nobody approached. Nobody spoke. The last time the brothers had spoken was by telephone, shortly before Wieland's deployment. The conversation had been brief and characteristically unserious. Wieland's final words to his elder brother were, "Don't worry. I'll come back and take that belt off you." He did not come back, and the belt, which had meant everything the day before, meant nothing the day after. Trophies are for the living. You might remember, if you are of a certain age, what Vietnam did to the families who waited. The grief did what grief always does to men who have been taught not to grieve. It went underground and emerged as something else. In Chuck's case, it emerged as purpose, the specific, ferocious kind that is really just rage wearing a suit. He became consumed by the fate of American prisoners of war still held in Vietnam. Whether those prisoners truly existed in the numbers claimed is a question historians still debate. Chuck did not debate it. He believed, because believing meant that his brother's death had not been for nothing, that someone could still be saved even if Wieland could not. He funded search expeditions. He lobbied politicians. He met with families of the missing. 14 years would pass before that grief found its way onto a screen. But when it did, it was unmistakable. In the meantime, Lee's death in '73 had left a vacuum in martial arts cinema, and Hollywood, which abhors a vacuum almost as much as nature does, began looking for someone to fill it. Chuck Norris was not the obvious choice. He was not handsome in the conventional leading man sense. He was not articulate. He was approaching 40. What he was, however, was authentic. He did not pretend to fight. He fought. The difference was visible on screen in a way that audiences could feel even if they could not articulate it. Good Guys Wear Black in '79. Lone Wolf McQuad in '83. The titles blurred, the budgets were modest, the critics were unkind. None of this mattered. What mattered was that Chuck Norris had found, in cinema, something he had never found in competition, a place where the dead could be resurrected, and the helpless could be saved, and the moral universe restored to order in 90 minutes. Then came Missing in Action, in 1984. Shot in the Philippines on a shoestring budget, the plot was simple almost to the point of parody. A former prisoner of war returns to Vietnam to rescue American soldiers still held captive. The politics were blunt. The dialogue was sparse. It should have been forgettable. Instead, it became a cultural phenomenon, a film that tapped directly into the unresolved trauma of an entire generation. On set, something happened that director Joseph Zito would later describe in interviews. There was a scene, the rescue, the climax, when the captives are freed from bamboo cages and carried to safety. Norris performed it in a single take. Zito remembered looking through the camera and seeing something that could not be manufactured. He wasn't acting, the director said. He was there. I don't know where there was exactly, but it wasn't the Philippines. Firebase ripcord. The 3rd of June. A telegram on the dojang floor. A brother who had promised to come home. Every rescued prisoner in that film was Wieland. Every cage broken open was the cage of grief. The audience, without knowing any of this, felt it. The film arrived at the right cultural moment. Ronald Reagan was in the White House. America wanted heroes who did not apologize, who solved problems with action rather than diplomacy. Stallone had Rambo. Norris had Colonel Braddock. The difference was that Stallone was playing a character. Norris was playing the version of himself that he wished were real, the version that could go back in time and pull his brother out of the jungle before the bullets found him. During those years, he also quietly helped a young Belgian named Jean-Claude Van Damme break into the industry. They met at a bar in Newport Beach in the late 80s. Norris made introductions, opened doors. Van Damme later acknowledged the debt publicly, though their paths diverged. It was a small act of generosity from a man who understood what it meant to start from nothing. Through the late 80s, as his fame grew, his marriage withered. In 1989, after 30 years, Diane and Chuck divorced. 30 years, an entire adult lifetime. Two sons, Mike, then 27, and Eric, 24 or 25, both grown, both shaped by a household in which the father was physically present but emotionally elsewhere. The stated reasons were the usual ones: careers that had diverged, people who had grown in different directions. The unstated reason was simpler and more corrosive: guilt. The knowledge that he had betrayed Diane before their marriage had found its footing, that a daughter existed whom he had never claimed. Every year of silence had added another layer of cement to a lie that had become structural. Diane was Carlos's wife. She had married the quiet boy from Torrance. She had not signed up for the fortress that Chuck had built around himself, and eventually the fortress had no room for her inside it. And then came the role that eclipsed everything. In 1993, CBS launched Walker, Texas Ranger, a series so perfectly calibrated to its audience that it ran for 8 seasons and 203 episodes without ever changing its formula. Chuck played Cordell Walker, a lawman of impeccable morality, unshakable courage, and very few words. Walker was everything the real man wished he could be, without secrets, without guilt, without a daughter hidden in the margins. The show was mocked by critics and adored by viewers, which is the definition of a hit. Behind the screen, the machinery of Hollywood was doing what it always does. Years later, when the reruns were generating rivers of money, Norris discovered those rivers were not flowing in his direction. The syndication profits were being retained by CBS and Sony in proportions his lawyers called unconscionable. In 2018, he filed a lawsuit seeking $30 million. The case dragged on for 5 years. It was settled in 2023 in his favor for a sum never disclosed. The man who played a ranger dedicated to justice had spent half a decade fighting for his own. Consider that irony for a moment. The most morally uncomplicated hero on American television, the man whose screen character never tolerated dishonesty, was being cheated by the very people who profited from his image. And off-screen, the same man had maintained his own dishonesty about Dina for decades. Justice, it turns out, is a mirror. It shows you the things you demand from others and the things you have failed to give yourself. By the end of the 90s, Chuck Norris owned one of the most successful television franchises in America and could afford anything he wanted. Anything except the chance to start over. And then, at a gathering in Dallas, he saw a woman 23 years his junior and decided that starting over was precisely what he needed. Her name was Gina O'Kelly. She was a model, a former beauty pageant contestant, born in 1963, the same year as the daughter he had abandoned. Whether he noticed the symmetry, he never said. But symmetry does not require acknowledgement to do its work. They married on the 28th of November, 1998. The ceremony was private, the guest list small. For a man whose career had been built on spectacle, the wedding was remarkably quiet. Perhaps he had learned, after 30 years with Diane and a decade of solitude, that the things worth keeping are the things you do not perform for an audience. On the 30th of August, 2001, just 12 days before the attacks that would change America forever, Gina gave birth to twins, Dakota Allen and Danielle Kelly. Chuck was 61. He had 2 grown sons, a secret daughter, and now 2 infants who would not sleep through the night. But on the ranch in Navasota, Texas, something resembling peace was taking shape. Before the wedding, he had told Gina about Dina. Her response, as he later recounted it, was characteristic. Everyone has a past. What interests me is who you are now. It was not absolution. It was something more practical, a refusal to define a person by their worst moment. In 2004, he published Against All Odds, My Story, and told the world what Gina had already accepted. He used the word sin, the specific, unambiguous language of a man whose moral framework was religious rather than therapeutic. The public reaction was muted. The news cycle moved on. A 64-year-old man confessing to a youthful transgression does not generate the same voltage as one denying it. His political convictions, meanwhile, were hardening into public positions. He wrote columns for WorldNet Daily. He endorsed Mike Huckabee for president, then later Donald Trump. He supported Proposition 8, the California ballot measure to ban same-sex marriage. He flirted with conspiracy theories about Barack Obama's citizenship. Each position earned him criticism from the cultural left and applause from the cultural right. He became a stranger in Hollywood and a hero in the heartland, the most morally certain man in a country that was rapidly losing its certainty about everything. But politics, however loud, was not the defining drama of his later years. That distinction belongs to something quieter, more frightening, and infinitely more personal. And to understand it, we must step back to 2005, when the internet did something to Chuck Norris that no opponent had ever managed. It turned him into a god. The year was 2005. Chuck Norris was 65 years old, semi-retired, living on a ranch in Texas, and almost entirely disconnected from the digital world that was rapidly reshaping how human beings communicated and constructed meaning. He did not have a social media account. He did not read blogs. He did not understand, in any practical sense, what a meme was. And then, with no warning and no permission, he became the most famous one on the planet. It began with comedy. The American television host Conan O'Brien aired a segment in which absurd, hyperbolic statements about Chuck Norris's toughness were presented as facts. Chuck Norris doesn't do press-ups, he pushes the earth down. When the bogeyman goes to sleep at night, he checks his wardrobe for Chuck Norris. The format was simple, the jokes were silly, and the effect was volcanic. Within weeks, Chuck Norris facts had migrated from late-night television to every corner of the early internet, forwarded in emails, posted on message boards, printed on T-shirts, repeated in school playgrounds and military barracks across the world. A dedicated website received millions of visitors. The phenomenon crossed languages, cultures, and generations with a speed no marketing campaign could have engineered, because it was not marketing. It was folklore, Paul Bunyan reborn as a karate expert with a beard. The man at the center of this eruption was bewildered. His sons tried to explain it. His managers tried to quantify it. Neither explanation fully landed. Chuck belonged to a generation that understood fame as something earned through effort, through years of training, through films, through sweat. The idea that millions of people could suddenly become obsessed with a version of you that bore almost no relation to reality, that existed entirely in the imagination of strangers. This was not fame as he understood it. He chose, wisely, to embrace it. The alternative, fighting the meme, demanding control, would have been like trying to stop a river with a legal injunction. He selected a favorite fact. When Chuck Norris enters a room, he doesn't turn the lights on, he turns the dark off. In a 2007 interview, he declared it theologically accurate. The remark revealed something the action films had never quite captured, a dry, self-aware wit. The meme became a second career. In 2009, he published the official Chuck Norris fact book. Advertising followed. A World of Warcraft commercial in 2011, a T-Mobile campaign in Central Europe, and a quick trip promotion in 2020 in which, at the age of 80, he descended from the sky on a parachute and fired hot dogs from a cannon into a cheering crowd. It was ridiculous. It was glorious. It was precisely the kind of spectacle the mythology demanded. His film cameos played the same game. In Dodgeball, released in 2004, he appeared for approximately 3 seconds, a spectator giving the protagonist an approving thumbs up. No dialogue, no choreography, just a nod. It became one of the most talked-about moments in the film. In The Expendables 2 in 2012, he insisted on delivering an actual Chuck Norris fact as dialogue. His character, Booker, tells a story about a cobra. Once, a cobra bit Chuck Norris. After 5 days of agonizing pain, the cobra died. The crew applauded. Stallone later remarked, "Chuck is the only man alive who can play a joke about himself and make it intimidating." And then there was the incident on the set of Walker, a story told so many times by crew members that its details have likely been polished by repetition, but whose essential truth has never been disputed. During a routine action scene, Norris was required to burst through a prop door, lightweight wood, pre-scored, designed to shatter at the slightest push. He kicked it. The prop door shattered as intended. So did the real door behind it, the one that was part of the permanent set. The director shouted, "Cut." Norris looked at the wreckage and said, "Was the door supposed to open?" The crew laughed for 10 minutes. The take was used in the final edit. These moments, the cobra, the thumbs up, the obliterated door, the parachute, constitute the comic dimension of a life that was, in most other respects, anything but comic. They reveal something the dramatic episodes sometimes obscure. The man had a sense of humor about himself. He understood that the gap between who he was and who the world believed him to be was so vast that the only sane response was laughter. But the laughter had a shadow. The meme replaced the man. Millions knew the jokes by heart, but did not know about the secret daughter, the dead brother, the sick wife. The digital version, omnipotent, invulnerable, eternal, had eclipsed the living person so completely that the living person had become invisible. The most famous Chuck Norris was the one who did not exist. In 2008, A writer named Ian Spector published a book called The Truth About Chuck Norris, a collection of internet facts presented without consent. Norris sued for trademark violation. The case was eventually dropped. You cannot trademark a cultural phenomenon. A meme, once released, belongs to everyone and no one. The attempt was the gesture of a man trying to reclaim a narrative that had slipped beyond his grasp. The internet had taken his name and built from it something magnificent and monstrous, a version that could never age, never fail, never sit helplessly beside a hospital bed. He wanted that version back. He could not have it. Nobody can reclaim a myth once it has entered the collective imagination. And it was a hospital bed that awaited him, not in myth, but in life. While the internet was building his digital monument, something was happening to the woman he loved that no amount of mythology could prevent. In 2012, Gina O'Kelly underwent 3 magnetic resonance imaging scans, routine procedures, the kind millions experience every year without incident. The scans required a contrast agent injected into the bloodstream to sharpen the images. The agent was gadolinium-based, a metallic compound that, according to the manufacturers, was safe and efficiently eliminated by the body within hours. After the 3rd scan, Gina began to feel something wrong. A burning sensation, not localized, not the kind of pain that points to a specific injury, but diffuse, systemic, as though something inside her was being slowly heated from within. Then came the tremors, then the joint pain, then the kidney problems. The healthy woman who had run a household, raised twins, and matched her husband's energy step for step, was suddenly unable to stand without assistance. She could not hold a cup without shaking. She could not sleep without pain. The diagnosis, unofficial, contested, not universally recognized by the medical establishment, was gadolinium deposition disease, a condition in which the metallic compound, rather than being flushed from the body as promised, accumulates in tissues, organs, and bones. The condition was rarely diagnosed, which is not the same as rare. The pharmaceutical industry earned billions from these agents annually and had little incentive to investigate complaints that might threaten a profitable product line. Think about what happened next, because it is the key to understanding who this man really was. Chuck Norris, the man whose entire identity had been built on the ability to act, to intervene, to solve problems through force and will, watched his wife disintegrate and could do nothing. There was no enemy to strike, no door to kick open, no cage to break. The adversary was a chemical compound measured in milliliters, distributed by corporations with legal departments larger than some armies, embedded in his wife's body at a molecular level no fist could reach. He did what he could. He spent more than $2 million on treatments, conventional and experimental, including controversial therapies in China. He sought specialists who had never heard of gadolinium deposition disease and specialists who had heard of nothing else. He flew Gina across oceans and back, chasing cures that might not exist for a condition some doctors insisted was not real. When medicine failed, he turned to law. In 2017, Chuck and Gina filed a lawsuit seeking $10 million against 11 companies, including Bracco Diagnostics and McKesson Corporation, alleging that they had known about the risks and prioritized profit over safety. During this period, he gave an interview to the program Full Measure that stripped away every layer of the public persona. "I would give everything I have," he said, and his voice did not waver, though the words clearly cost him. "All the movies, the entire career, all the money, if I could give her back her health." It was perhaps the most honest sentence Chuck Norris ever spoke in public. No karate, no bravado. Just a 77-year-old husband beside his sick wife, offering to trade everything he had built for the one thing money could not purchase. The lawsuit ground forward with the particular cruelty that characterizes litigation against large corporations. Depositions, counter-filings, legal motions designed not to resolve the case, but to delay it until the plaintiff's resolve gave out. In 2020, the case was partially withdrawn without a financial settlement. No admission of wrongdoing. No payout. But the fight had contributed to a larger public conversation, one that, in 2017, prompted the United States Food and Drug Administration to issue new safety warnings about gadolinium retention in patients' bodies. It was not vindication, but it was not nothing. Gina's health stabilized, though stabilized is a generous term for a condition with no recognized cure. She improved enough to function, enough to stand beside her husband at the occasional appearance. But something had been taken from her that no therapy could restore. And something had been taken from him, the last remnant of the belief, cultivated across a lifetime, that willpower alone was sufficient to defeat any adversary. His film career effectively ended during this period. The Expendables 2 cameo in 2012 was the last significant appearance. He chose his wife over the camera, and for a man who had lived on screen for 35 years, the choice was a quiet kind of retirement that no press release ever announced. He simply stopped appearing. The screen went dark. The pharmaceutical companies proved to be the one opponent Chuck Norris could not overcome. Not with his fists, not with his lawyers, not with his fame. The man the internet insisted could not be defeated had been defeated, privately and thoroughly, by 11 corporations and a metallic element with the atomic number 64. In 2024, Wilma Scarberry died. She was Chuck's mother, the woman who had held a family together that should have shattered, who had said, "We'll manage." So many times the words had worn smooth like river stones. She had lived long enough to see her eldest son become the most famous martial artist in American history. She had lived long enough to know about Dina, about the divorce, about Gina's illness, all of it. Chuck released no statement. He did not appear on television to discuss his grief. The family pattern held, silence in the face of loss. But those who understood the architecture of his life knew what Wilma's death meant. She was the last person alive who remembered the boy before the name changed, before the belt, before the cameras. With her gone, there was no one left who could look at Chuck Norris and see Carlos. After his 80th birthday, the public appearances grew sparse. The man who had once toured the world now rarely left Texas, except for Kauai, the oldest of the major Hawaiian islands and the quietest, not Maui, where celebrities build compounds behind gates. Not Oahu, where tourists crowd Waikiki. Kauai is green and unhurried, its coastline dramatic, its towns small, its prevailing ethos one of deliberate disengagement from the velocity of the mainland. Chuck and Gina had been spending time there increasingly in their later years. Neighbors knew him as a quiet elderly man who walked the beach early in the morning, not a celebrity, not a legend. Just a neighbor who nodded hello and kept moving, as though the walk itself was the point and everything else was merely what he was walking away from. He continued to train after a fashion. The explosive kicks were long gone, replaced by breathing exercises, meditation, and slow, controlled movements from the system he had created. His body, which had once been a weapon of extraordinary precision, was now simply a body, aging, stiffening, requiring maintenance rather than deployment. But he maintained it, every day. The discipline that had carried him from a Korean dojang to a world championship to a Hollywood career did not retire. It adapted. The last business venture was, fittingly, about water. Around 2012, drilling on the Navasota ranch struck an aquifer of exceptional purity. By 2015, the discovery had become Seaforce Bottling Co., selling water under the slogan, "Water that kicks." It was a small operation, a fraction of his empire, but it pleased him. There was something satisfying, he told an interviewer, about selling something that came from his own land that required no performance and no persona. In 2023, after the Walker lawsuit was settled, he spoke briefly to journalists. "Justice exists," he said, "but you have to fight for it longer than you'd think." It was a sentence that could have applied to every struggle of his life. He did not elaborate. He never elaborated. On the 10th of March, 2026, he turned 86. Fan sites posted the usual jokes. Chuck Norris doesn't get older, time gets younger. The man they described was fiction. The man they celebrated was real. And the real man had 9 days left. On the 18th of March, 2026, Chuck Norris was hospitalized on Kauai following what his family described only as a sudden medical emergency. The nature of the emergency was not disclosed. The hospital was not named. The details, the specific, clinical, human details of what happens when a body that has endured 86 years of living reaches its limit, were kept within the family. The public learned only that he had been admitted, that his condition was serious, and that those closest to him were at his side. 1 day later, on the 19th of March, 2026, he died. He had outlived his father, his mother, his brother, and Bruce Lee. He had not outlived the meme, which would continue circulating long after the servers that hosted it had been replaced by newer ones. The meme was the closest thing to immortality that the 21st century could offer. It was also the furthest thing from the man it described. The family released a statement through Instagram, the platform of choice for announcements that are simultaneously intimate and global. He was surrounded by his loved ones, it read, and passed in peace. 9 words. That was all. The statement did not describe his career. It did not list his titles. It said only that he was loved and that he was peaceful, which is, when you strip away everything else, the only obituary that matters. He died 9 days after his birthday. 9 days, like 9 rounds of a fight that nobody witnessed and nobody will score. The last bout, conducted in private, with no audience and no cameras, in a hospital room on an island in the middle of the Pacific. 3,000 miles from the Texas ranch. 4,000 miles from the Oklahoma dust where it all began. The distance was not incidental. It was the final journey of a man who had spent his life moving from town to town as a child, from base to base as a soldier, from ring to ring as a fighter, from set to set as an actor, and who had found, at last, a place where movement was no longer required. The ocean did not demand proof of strength. The wind did not care about his name. The world learned on the 20th of March. Reuters carried the story first, followed within minutes by every major news organization on the planet. The BBC, Le Monde, Hello Magazine, the Houston Chronicle. The coverage was extensive and remarkably uniform. A summary of the career, a list of famous films, a selection of Chuck Norris facts as comic relief, a brief mention of family and charity. The coverage was also, in its uniformity, a kind of erasure, the reduction of a complex, contradictory, deeply human life into bullet points and punchlines. Social media reacted as it always reacts to the death of a cultural figure, with a tsunami of content that was simultaneously heartfelt and performative. People did not post solemn remembrances. They posted memes. Death came for Chuck Norris, but Chuck Norris came for death. Chuck Norris didn't die, he just went to heaven to check the perimeter. The afterlife didn't have Chuck Norris. Now it does. God is nervous. The jokes were affectionate and relentless, and in their way the most honest form of mourning the internet generation knows. Laughter as elegy, absurdity as grief. The refusal to be solemn about a man whose entire public identity had been built on the refusal to be ordinary. Politicians responded along predictable lines. Republican leaders praised his patriotism and faith. Democratic leaders offered brief condolences. The martial arts world, the UFC, the World Karate Association, federations from Seoul to Sao Paulo, honored a pioneer who proved that martial arts are not merely sport but philosophy. Wikipedia was updated within hours. The entry that had begun with Carlos Ray Norris, born March 10, 1940, now read Carlos Ray Norris, March 10, 1940, March 19, 2026. A dash between two dates, the smallest punctuation mark carrying the largest possible weight. For 21 years, the foundational premise of every Chuck Norris fact had been that he could not die. And now the premise had been disproved in the most unambiguous way possible. The jokes continued. They could not stop, any more than a river can reverse. But beneath them was something the format could not quite contain. The recognition that a real man had lived and suffered and loved and lied and fought and failed and died. For one moment, the world looked past the meme and glimpsed the human being. Then the moment passed, and the memes resumed, because looking at the human being for too long was more than most people could bear. But death is not the end of a story. It is the beginning of a different question. What remains? 5 children. It is a number that fits neatly into a sentence and messily into a life. 5 children from 2 marriages and 1 affair that lasted no longer than a season, but whose consequences stretched across decades. Each carries a fragment of the real man, not the myth, but the actual person, with his silences and his disciplines and his failures and his stubborn, imperfect love. Mike, the eldest, born in 1962, the year the affair with Johanna began, the year the lie was conceived alongside the child it would conceal. He grew up as the eldest acknowledged son of a man whose fame left little room for the ordinary rituals of fatherhood. He became an actor, appearing in several of his father's films, occupying the particular purgatory reserved for children of famous performers, talented enough to work, overshadowed enough never to be seen on their own terms. Eric, born in 64 or 65, chose a different path. He became a stunt performer and racing driver, physical risk, as a language of connection with a father who understood the body better than words. He worked on Walker, Texas Ranger, as a stunt coordinator, which meant years of watching his father pretend to fight on screen while knowing what the real thing looked like. Then there was Dina. Born in '63, she spent nearly 3 decades without a father, not absent in the way military fathers are absent, returning periodically with gifts. Absent in the way a person is absent when they have chosen to pretend you do not exist. She found him around 1990. She knocked on that door. She said those 5 words. And then, over 14 years, they built something tentative, scarred, but real before he told the world in 2004. Dina has never given a detailed public interview about her father. She has never written a memoir or sold a story. In a culture that monetizes trauma with industrial efficiency, her silence is remarkable. It is also familiar, the same silence her father practiced for decades, the same refusal to expose the interior life to strangers. Whether she learned it from him or whether it is simply the habit of someone who grew up without a voice in her own story, she has not said. The silence itself is her answer. Dakota and Danilee, the twins, were 24 when their father died. They had grown up on the ranch in Navasota, educated at home, far from cameras. They did not pursue public careers. They existed in the public record as names in a family statement and faces in occasional photographs. Young people who had the unusual experience of growing up with a father who was simultaneously flesh and blood parent and internet deity, a man who helped with homework in the morning and was declared capable of dividing by 0 in the afternoon. The gap between the mythology and the reality must have been, for those children, a daily exercise in something no university teaches. They learned early what most people never learn at all. The world does not see people, it sees stories. 5 children, 13 grandchildren at least, probably more. A family tree rooted in Oklahoma dust and watered by silence. Beyond the family, there was the work, and the work that mattered most was not what the world remembered. It was not the films. It was not the championships. It was a program called Kickstart Kids. He founded it in the early 90s. Some sources say 1990, others 92. The original name was Kick Drugs Out of America. The concept was straightforward. Provide free martial arts instruction to children from disadvantaged backgrounds in Texas public schools. Not as an after-school novelty, not as a celebrity visit, as a sustained, curriculum-integrated program taught by trained instructors week after week, year after year. The reasoning was personal. He had been a child without confidence, without direction, without the tools to navigate a world designed to ignore him. The Dojang in Korea had been the first place where he felt capable. He wanted to give other children the same chance. It was not charity in the conventional sense. It was replication, the attempt to reproduce at scale, the transformation that had saved his own life. By the time of his death, more than 110,000 children had passed through the program. The number is large enough to be abstract, so consider it differently. Imagine a stadium filled to capacity. Every seat occupied by a young person who learned to throw a punch, to hold a stance, to bow to an opponent, to understand that discipline is not punishment, but liberation. Most of those children went on to ordinary lives, jobs, families, mortgages, carrying with them the physical memory of standing in a school gymnasium and discovering that their bodies could do things they had not believed possible. The program's code of honor began with a sentence that reads less like a guideline and more like a covenant. I will develop myself to the maximum of my potential in all ways. It is the kind of sentence a man writes when he believes, without reservation, that words can change behavior. The 110,000 children suggest the belief was not entirely misplaced. There was also Chun Kuk Do, the martial arts system he had codified in 1990 and renamed the Chuck Norris system in 2015. Schools teaching it operated across the United States, Europe, and Asia. Thousands of students practiced its forms and followed its code. It was not the largest martial arts organization in the world, but it was real, a living institution that would continue after the man who created it had stopped breathing, which is more than most people build in a lifetime. And then there was the cultural legacy, the hardest to define, the most likely to shift over time. Chuck Norris was one of the first conservative celebrities to use fame as a political platform. The line from him through Clint Eastwood to the political landscape of the 21st century is not straight. It zigzags through decades of cultural change, but it is recognizable, and his footprints are on it. This legacy is not uncomplicated. His support for Proposition 8 placed him on the wrong side of a civil rights issue that the Supreme Court would settle within a decade. His flirtation with birther conspiracy theories associated his name with a movement history has judged harshly. His political endorsements ensured that his legacy would be permanently fractured along partisan lines, celebrated by some, condemned by others, reduced by both sides to a symbol rather than a person. You may have your own view on this. You are entitled to it. But here is a question worth sitting with. Can you respect a person whose convictions you do not share while acknowledging both the good they built and the harm they caused? That is not a question about Chuck Norris. It is a question about how we make sense of anyone whose life refuses to fit neatly into a single category. Schools, children, championships, films, memes, a martial arts system, a philanthropic program that touched over 100,000 young lives, 5 children, and at least 13 grandchildren. All of this would remain. It would outlast the news cycle and the obituaries. It would outlast the political controversies. What would remain longest and most stubbornly was something that could not be quantified or captured in an encyclopedia entry. It was the sound of a knock on a door and 5 words that contained an entire life's worth of pain and hope. Hello, I'm your daughter. We began this story with a knock on a door. Let us end it there. It is 1990, or perhaps 91. A house in Los Angeles. The air smells of jasmine and exhaust and the particular dryness of a Southern California afternoon. Inside, a man is doing what he always does when he is not on camera or on a mat. He is being quiet. He has spent 50 years perfecting the art of silence, not the comfortable silence of a man at peace, but the rigid, practiced silence of a man who knows that if he opens his mouth, the wrong thing might come out. The wrong name, the wrong confession, the wrong word that unravels everything. There is a knock. He opens the door and there she is, late 20s, dark hair, steady hands. She does not look like him, or perhaps she does, in the way that children resemble their parents only when you know to look. A tilt of the jaw, a stillness in the posture, a patience that could be mistaken for calm, but is actually the opposite, the held breath of someone preparing for a blow. Now you know what he knew in that moment. You know about Ryan, Oklahoma, and the dust, and the father who drank until he disappeared. You know about Wilma, who held everything together with faith and exhaustion. You know about the Dojang in Korea, where a frightened boy discovered that his body could be a weapon and his fear could be fuel. You know about the name Chuck, given by a stranger who could not pronounce Carlos, and how that name became a suit of armor so effective that the man inside it eventually forgot how to take it off. You know about Diane, who married the quiet boy and watched him become someone she could not reach. You know about Wieland, who called from the base before shipping out and said he would come back and take the belt, and who did not come back, and whose absence echoes through every rescue scene in every film his brother ever made. You know about Bruce Lee, who moved like water and died like lightning at 32, leaving behind a void that Hollywood filled with men who were not him. You know about the championships, the schools, the screen, the kicks that cameras could not capture without blur. You know about missing in action and firebase ripcord, and the fact that every bamboo cage broken open on a Filipino soundstage was really a casket being pried apart in the imagination of a grieving brother. You know about Walker, Texas Ranger, and the syndication money that flowed everywhere, except to the man whose face earned it. You know about Gina, who said everyone has a past, and meant it, and who then walked into a hospital for a routine scan and walked out with poison in her bones. You know about the memes, the cobra, the bogeyman, the revolving door, the internet's insistence that this man could not die. You know about the lawsuit, the $2 million, the therapies in China, the FDA warning that came too late for one family but might save others. You know about Kauai, the ocean, the morning walks, the quiet. You know about the 19th of March, 2026, and the 9 words on Instagram. He was surrounded by his loved ones and passed in peace. You know all of this, and because you know it, the woman in the doorway means something different now than she did at the beginning. She is not a plot twist. She is not a scandal. She is the point. She is the single thread that, when pulled, unravels the entire tapestry of a man's public life and reveals the private one underneath. Smaller, messier, more human, more real. She is the daughter he fathered in 1962 or 63 and refused to acknowledge for nearly 30 years. She is the proof that the strongest man in America was not strong enough to face his own reflection. She is also the proof that he eventually did face it, not with a kick, not on a screen, but in a book, before the entire world, using the word sin, because he was a Baptist and Baptists do not believe in euphemisms. She stood in the doorway. He stood in the doorway. And for a moment, every wall he had ever built, the name, the belt, the career, the silence came down, not dramatically, not cinematically, just a man looking at a young woman and seeing the cost of his cowardice staring back at him with his own eyes. He had 2 names. That is where this ends. The first was given by his mother in a small hospital in Ryan, Oklahoma, in March of 1940. Wilma named him Carlos. Carlos Ray Norris, a name with Spanish syllables and Cherokee blood and the red dust of the Great Plains in its vowels. Carlos was a shy boy who hid behind beds when his parents fought. Carlos was a mediocre student who could not talk to girls. Carlos was a young husband who betrayed his wife before the ink on the marriage certificate was dry, and who then spent 3 decades pretending the betrayal had not produced a living, breathing human being. Carlos was afraid. Carlos was ashamed. Carlos was, in every way that mattered, ordinary and ordinariness, for a man who grew up with nothing, felt like a death sentence. The second name was given by a stranger on a military base in South Korea, sometime around 1959. a fellow airman who could not wrap his tongue around Carlos, and who said, with the casual authority of someone solving a minor problem, "You look like a Chuck to me." Chuck, hard consonant, short vowel, a name like a door slamming shut. Chuck was a six-time world champion. Chuck was a movie star. Chuck was a television icon, a political voice, a cultural monument, an internet god. Chuck did not hide behind beds. Chuck kicked through doors, real ones, not just props. Chuck was afraid of nothing, which was the whole point, because Carlos was afraid of everything, and Chuck had been invented specifically to make Carlos disappear. The invention worked. It worked so well that for decades, the inventor could not find his way back. Chuck became the name on the marquee, the name on the checkbook, the name the world chanted. Carlos became a ghost, a faint signal buried under layers of mythology, audible only to those who knew where to listen. Wilma could hear it. Diane could hear it once. Wieland could hear it before the jungle swallowed him. Gina learned to hear it. And Dina had never heard anything else, because she had never met Chuck. She had only ever known that somewhere in America there was a man named Carlos who was supposed to be her father and who had chosen not to be. On a screen, the division is clean. The hero and the man, the role and the actor. The credits roll, the lights come up, and everyone goes home knowing which is which. In life, the division is not clean. It is not even a division. It is a blur, a smear, a palimpsest, one identity written over another, neither fully legible, both always present. Chuck Norris was not a mask that Carlos wore. Carlos was not a weakness that Chuck overcame. They were the same person, and that person was both braver and more frightened, both stronger and more broken, both more admirable and more disappointing than either name alone could contain. He died on the 19th of March, 2026, on an island in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. He was 86 years old. The cause was not disclosed. The family asked for privacy and received it, briefly, before the memes resumed and the obituaries were filed, and the world moved on to the next notification. Somewhere on a ranch in Navasota, Texas, the water from an aquifer he had discovered continued to rise through ancient rock, pure and cold, and indifferent to the fact that the man who had bottled it was no longer breathing. Somewhere in a school gymnasium in Houston or San Antonio or El Paso, a child who had never heard of Chuck Norris stood in a fighting stance for the first time, learning through muscle and bone what it feels like to be capable. Somewhere on the internet, everywhere on the internet, the jokes continued. Chuck Norris can slam a revolving door. Chuck Norris counted to infinity. Twice. A death once had a near Chuck Norris experience. The jokes will not stop. They are in their strange way a form of love, the only form the internet truly understands. They will outlast the films which will fade. They will outlast the championships which already have. They will outlast the political controversies which history will compress into footnotes. The jokes are eternal, or as close to eternal as anything made of ones and zeros can be, and that is fine. Laughter is a kind of remembrance. It is not the deepest kind, but it is real. The deepest kind is quieter. It lives in 5 children who each knew a different man. In 110,000 young people who learn to stand up straight in a school gymnasium, because a boy from Oklahoma remembered what it felt like to be unable to. In a wife who forgave him for a past he could not undo. In a daughter who found him after 28 years, knocked on a door, spoke 5 words and waited. Somewhere right now, someone is typing Chuck Norris facts. into a search engine and laughing. That is fine. But if that someone has listened this far, truly listened, past the kicks and the memes and the mythology, they might pause for a moment. They might think about the boy from Ryan who was afraid of his own father, about the man who could break anyone's jaw but could not say one simple word to his own daughter, about the husband who gave up everything, the screen, the fame, the career, to sit beside a hospital bed and hold a trembling hand. He said the word eventually, not with a fist but with a book, not on a ring but before the whole world. And that perhaps was the strongest blow he ever landed. His name was Carlos Ray Norris. Some people called him Chuck.